1982, I saw this series of structures and photographed it. The administrator of the Transvaal, that is, of the province in which this series of structures stands, decided that the province, the Transvaal, and the city, Pretoria, needed an opera house. So he commissioned an architect to design an opera house to be put on this square, which was known as the Market Square in Pretoria. And when the architect concerned was beginning to plan this, another architect, in conversation with him, said, well, I've been commissioned to do a monument to the Republic of South Africa. So they collaborated. And the collaboration consisted of a design for the opera house and two monuments. The one monument would be to J.G. Strydom, a man who had been the Prime Minister of South Africa under the National Party, the apartheid government, and who is now deceased, and one of the leading architects of apartheid. The other monument would consist of 4 horses in gallop, symbolizing the 4 provinces of South Africa, straining towards the future to commemorate the 5th anniversary of the Republic of South Africa, which was formed in 1961, when under Dr. Verwoerd, the principal architect of apartheid, South Africa was taken out of the Commonwealth of Nations, the British Commonwealth, and became an independent republic. So we have here 2 monuments, one to J.G. Strydom, one to the Republic of South Africa. And there is an opera house. So the 2 architects together built a maquette of the proposed structures and showed it to the administrator of the Transvaal. And he said, oh no, hold on. You cannot have J.G. Strydom looking at what he called curry shops. In other words, shops owned by Indians, because the whole orientation of these structures was the other way, and Strydom would have been looking out onto a street of Indian-owned shops. So the administrator objected to that, and the architects had to redesign the thing and put the opera house on the other side and these monuments here. Meanwhile, the empty space that was created in the Market Square was put up for tender, and there was only one tender, and that was by volkskas. Volk meaning people, kas meaning the box, the money box of the people, which was the Afrikaner National Bank formed to mobilize Afrikaner capital against English capital. So we have here a conglomeration or a concatenation of ideas and values. J.G. Strydom, who represented apartheid, the horses representing the Republic of South Africa, which was now independent, which was the great dream of Afrikaners, to be independent of Great Britain, and the corporate headquarters of the Volkskas Bank. And I photographed it, as I said, in 1982. Well, on the 40th anniversary of the Republic of South Africa, that is in the year 2001, at about 3 o'clock in the morning, J.G. Strydom fell through the floor here into the parking garage below. This huge head on its plinth simply fell into the floor below and was smashed. And of course, and I think the parabolic shelter of the sculpture was also severely damaged. There were no casualties. 2 homeless people were sleeping nearby and they were slightly injured. There was no suspicion of sabotage. There was no easy solution to the question of what happened to Mr. Strydom. Places of worship, sacred places, are to me very significant in revealing social mores, ethos, and values. And in South Africa, this was perhaps more so than in other societies or many other societies. I come from South Africa and I don't know other societies as intimately as I do South Africa. But certainly in South Africa, sacred architecture, the churches and the synagogues and the mosques and the temples are very significant in revealing the values of the particular groups within society that they come from. This is a Dutch Reformed church, NG Gereformeerde Kerk, the National Redolence Reformed Church in South Africa. When I first saw this church, it seemed to me that it was an attempt on the part of this architect to go back to the round, hut-shaped homes of Africans, and perhaps even to go back into the womb of Africa. He grew up on a mission station in Botswana, what used to be Bechuanaland. His father was a missionary there. They had very little money, especially money that they needed for the building of the church buildings. And he learned that the circle is the most economical and structurally the most powerful, the strongest structure that you can make using the fewest materials. When he became an architect, building churches for this Dutch Reformed Church group, this Protestant group, he found that the communities usually wanted cathedral-like height at the top of the church at the beginning, and then they were not particular about what happened after that, but they wanted cathedral-like height, and they wanted this for the lowest possible cost. And so, as you see, the front of the church is rounded. In this way, he was able to use a pure brick structure of considerable height without reinforced concrete, thus making the church much cheaper to build for the size of the structure that he was giving the community. It is also significant that when this church was built, which was during the 1970s, the folk, the Afrikaner people, were under attack. The forces of liberation were coming down Africa. The African National Congress and the Southwest African People's Organization and Frelimo in the West and the MPW in the West, in Angola. These forces of liberation were coming down Africa, and they were assisted by the communist countries of the time, particularly by Cuba and by Russia. There was a tendency to close down, to close in. So the churches of the Afrikaner Protestant faith became more and more like the lager, the circle of wagons with which the Afrikaners defended themselves when they penetrated the interior and fought against such tribes as the Zulus. Churches were built with very few piercings in their outer walls. When I questioned architects about this, they said, well, this enabled them to have better climate control. And this was true. These churches were easier to warm in the winter, and there was less glare in the summer. So it made sense. But the question is, why didn't they choose that building form in the 50s and the 60s? And in my opinion, they didn't choose those, although they were known, because the Americans had already used such forms. They didn't choose them at that time because that was the time of apartheid in triumph, triumphant apartheid. And this was the time in the 70s and into the 80s of apartheid on the defensive. This is a scene in Johannesburg in which there are two features that I want to talk about. On the right, we have a sculpture by William Kentridge and Gerard Marx called, if I'm not mistaken, The Firewalker. This depicts an African woman, a black woman, carrying a brazier of live coals on her head. These women are seen frequently on the sidewalks of the city. The brazier, this tin with holes on the sides and full of burning coal, is used for cooking or braising or roasting mealies, that is corn, and meat, sheep's heads, things like that. It's a very imaginative piece of sculpture, and when you drive over this bridge, the Queen Elizabeth Bridge, at first you can't make out what this is. And as you come to a certain point, the logic of that piece of sculpture becomes apparent. The other aspect of this photograph that is particularly notable is this confusion of broken paving stones. This confusion arises from our high crime rate. You see, between that lamppost and this lamppost, there was a copper cable connecting the two, underground. And there was a copper cable from this lamppost to the next one, underground. And what had happened here was that a bakkie, that is a small pickup truck, would have driven past here, probably at night, in the depths of the night, and a rope would have been attached to one end of this copper cable, and the other end would have been attached to the back of the pickup. The pickup would have driven forward, ripped up the cable, ripped up the paving stones, and the copper cable would have been stolen. This, I'm afraid, is something that's almost endemic now in our society. Copper cable has a very high price in the marketplace, and the thieves are not shy of stealing them from railway signaling systems, from anywhere where they can find copper cable. A terrible thing had just happened in this photograph. This lady's house, her shelter, had been demolished by officials of the government. The photograph was taken at Crossroads in Cape Town, or outside Cape Town, and most of the people who were there came from Transkei and Ciskei, Eastern Cape, black, so-called homelands. Homelands where there was no employment for the huge numbers that were living there, and the people came here to Cape Town to seek work. But this was a so-called colored preference area. The government had decreed that the people of color, if you will forgive that term, the people of color who would be preferred for work would be the colored people, that is, the people of mixed origin. Black people, black indigenous South Africans, would not be allowed to come and work there unless there were jobs that colored couldn't fulfill. So their shelters were made from Port Jackson bush. They would cut strips of the branches. They would then bend these branches over their possessions in a dome, and they would cover these branches then in an ingenious way with plastic, with sheets of plastic. At the higher points on the dome, they would put translucent plastic. In other words, sunlight or light could come through it. And then to give themselves some measure of privacy, they would have black sheets of plastic on the lower parts of their shelter. Well, this woman's shelter had just been destroyed. In terms of a court case, the government was not entitled to destroy or confiscate the sheets of plastic. So they would put sheets of plastic aside. They did destroy the framework of the shelter. So this lady, who is now resting with her child, would have to get up and cut fresh branches from the Port Jackson bush, create a new domed framework for her home, and then cover it with plastic. Here we have two kinds of housing. In the foreground are the remains of a little girl's house game, epope. It's notable that the homestead that they made out of stones here is round rather than rectangular, indicating that these young people were used to living in traditional homesteads with round homes, rondavels. In the background, we have another kind of housing. This was a government or a municipal scheme of houses that would be given to the local black population who were living in shacks that they erected themselves. But these houses are not complete, as you see. The housing scheme had run into trouble. They had found clay in the soil that made it very difficult to build. They had run out of money. There were various problems associated with this housing scheme. I could find no evidence of corruption when I inquired, but quite possibly there had been corruption or the attempt at it, because that was very common in post-apartheid South African housing schemes. The township houses were eventually completed, and people are now living there. This is a photograph that I regard as being one full of hope. Here we have a typical black township prescribed in terms of our laws, our segregation laws, in a small seaside town, Kenton-on-Sea. But this was taken at the time when the apartheid laws were being dismantled. And this man had bought, or been given, I think, this little plot of ground on which to build his own house. And he was building his own house when I saw him and met him. I believe in the strength of his back and the way he's tipping that wheelbarrow that he was doing this with a certain satisfaction, because he would now have a property and he would now be able to go to a bank and even get a mortgage if he needed it or wanted it on his property. Something that urban black people had never been allowed to do, at least not since 1913, when South Africa passed a law prohibiting blacks from owning property within South Africa. Here was a scheme by the apartheid government to keep Pretoria, one of our capital cities in South Africa, white. They proposed to do that by settling a large number of families of white civil servants close to the city centre. In order to do this, they built 5 substantial skyscrapers, 4 of them in this photograph, and there were to be 7 such buildings altogether, and they would house something like 10,000 people. That's a lot of housing. 4 of these buildings were built here, and another one just beyond the frame of the photograph, when the international banks refused to roll over the loans on which the government depended to finance apartheid. So the scheme was never fully built. Only 5 of the buildings went up. Eventually, at the end of apartheid in the 1990s, these buildings were thrown open to occupation by people of any race. And they were. But something happened, and I'm not sure what it was. But gradually, the buildings fell into disrepair. They were not properly managed. And after they fell into disrepair, after the elevators stopped working and the sewerage and the water stopped working properly, because the accounts perhaps were not paid, they fell into disrepair. And finally, the last straw, people robbed the buildings of any material that could be moved. So the pipes for the plumbing, the doors, the windows, anything, the taps, anything that could be removed and sold was removed and sold by people living in the area. So Pretoria now has 5 huge skeletons of buildings. One of them can't even be rebuilt because there was a fire and the structure is unsafe. So some probably, I don't know, perhaps 8,000 people who could have been housed here are not.